Hi there, everybody. I hope you're doing well. Just enjoying my delicious coffee. Today it's another decaf from Onyx Roasters. I really enjoy decaf because it lets me have a nice warm drink in the evening, especially since I can't drink hot chocolate or anything like that because of my health. It's a pretty nutty coffee, so it's pretty nice. I got some feedback from everybody about positioning, how the chair made me look tiny, so I'm trying to sit more in the middle, and I kind of rearrange things a little bit and try and have it zoomed in. I'd love to get more feedback to try and keep improving this setup, so feel free to give me some feedback. Today I want to talk about a book I just finished last week or so called The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates. By the same author that wrote Between the World and Me. And I kind of want to use it as a mechanism to discuss a little bit of this book down here called The Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. I'll get into why I think those two are somewhat related and important. So if you're familiar with Coates, he wrote the first book I read of his was Between the World and Me, which was a letter to his son, who was, I think, 15 at the time, trying to help him understand the world that he was navigating. Then I went on to read his Black Panther run from Marvel Comics. Really interesting run, especially with the interactions with Black Panther, T'Challa, interacting with Captain America, and that tension of that imperialism naturally from those interactions. And then, of course, he's written a lot of stuff for the Atlantic. I think now he's teaching at Howard University, and while at Howard, he wrote the book The Message, which I'll put right here. Unfortunately, I have issues with reading paperback books now, so I read it on Kindle, so I don't have a physical copy of it here. But similar to the conceit that he used for writing a letter to Between the World and Me, he wrote an introduction to this book to his students of a writing class. And so it was a similar approach for Between the World and Me, and he kind of joked throughout the book that he wasn't a good student still because he was a bad student whenever he was an undergrad himself, and then he had committed to letting the students critique his writing, but he never delivered anything. So there's a bit of a memoir portion to that. I mean, really the whole book is a memoir, as much as about his own craft as a writer, his own anxieties of being a writer, and which is really, for someone who's trying to get into more and more writing himself, it's really great to hear the anxieties of people you really look up to, because Coates is a fantastic writer. He is in a nonfiction story where he is talking about the door of no return in Senegal and the visiting Palestinians in Palestine. He really manages to pull out of a lot of emotions out of, at least he did out of me. So after this letter, there's really only 3 parts to this book. I thought there was going to be more initially when I picked it up. The first part was him going to Africa to understand what his culture was, or what he had left behind, or his family ancestors had left behind when they were captured and enslaved. And it was really heartwarming in some cases, and it was also just a very sad, meditative story on loss. And he kept reflecting on this idea of him as a young boy on the Atlantic, going out to sea and sending out boats and things. So he really, every time he went down to the coast, he really thought about this. And then, of course, he went to the island with the door of the no return, which, if you're interested in seeing that, there is a documentary, a Netflix documentary about Southern and African style, like African American style cooking, where the host went from, he went around the southern U.S., but he also went to the door of no return as well. And it is a very depressing place. It is very important as a memorial for the history of what the world did to the African continent generally, and then also what was done in the U.S., because it is the doorway to the United States, which is something that white Americans really need to be considering, because it is as much our legacy as Coates' legacy, because there's a large number of Americans that were buying the person that came out of that, and we need to reconcile that with as white Americans. So the other thing that he did was he did go and go to Palestine afterwards, and he met with a large number of Palestinians to try to understand how, I want to be explicit, he called it Palestine during this section, and then he went to Israel and he explicitly called it more Israel in that portion. And I think that was an intentional conceit, because he was visiting Palestinians in the West Bank, which is ostensibly Palestinian land. And then when he came to Israel, he was on Israeli land. And I think it is an important distinction to think about as you consider these different places, because there are different customs, there's different histories, and there's different interactions between those lands and the rest of the world, and especially between Israel and Palestine, of course. So the other book that I really kind of thought about as I was reading this is Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's An Indigenous History of the United States, which again is a very important naming mechanism as well, because it is not Indigenous Peoples History of America, it is of the United States, which means it is the interaction between Native peoples and the ever encroaching western edge of the United States. And whenever the Native peoples were Indigenous peoples were inside of the United States, the ongoing tensions and histories of that. Overall, Dunbar Ortiz has written a number of books about this topic, white settler colonialism. I think she's a fairly prominent name in the space. I don't think she's beyond critique. I don't think any historian is beyond critique. She's really did a good job describing how the people that came over to America as immigrants were looking for things. They were looking for land.
Liberty and freedom, even vis-a-vis one another. Let's be honest, we came for stuff. We came for stuff like opportunity, stuff like land, stuff like the ability to survive because things weren't working back home. Like, we need to be honest about, like, our people were the losers of Europe.
And a lot of them were coming over from Ireland because they were being pretty well abused by the English during this time period. And so they were looking to try and get their own land. They were trying to establish themselves in their own way. They moved over and they came to places like Ohio, and then they would move farther west than that to like Nebraska. They would intentionally put fencing and around prairie land that the indigenous tribes would be using for their buffalo herds and for their regular nomadic travels as they followed their herds and moved to different parts of the high desert and prairie of the Midwest. This intentionally put the settlers in conflict with the tribes, and often the settlers would continue to push and push until there was a strong reaction from the indigenous nations where they would retaliate. And at that point, the settlers would request help from the U.S. military, and the U.S. military would then come in, put a fort in, and then force another treaty signature, and then push the indigenous tribes back again. And this would happen again and again and again. It was an intentional effort, and it was sanctioned by the U.S., even if it wasn't explicitly sanctioned by the U.S. You can see that it was implicitly done because of the way that the military would always come in to support the settlers anytime that they needed the support. They never forced the settlers to withdraw. And really, this was part of Manifest Destiny. It was the intention of that. And I think we need to reckon with that as white Americans, especially since this is what led to the Trails of Tears. This is why we had the 49ers go out into California. And ultimately, the slaughter of all the buffaloes, or ultimately the slaughter of a large number of buffaloes on the plains. Settle down there, Scott. Jeez. And I think it's important to note that while we were doing this, at some portion this was happening during the Civil War, and the Union was fighting the South and a variety of tribes in the prairie land during the Civil War. It wasn't we didn't stop moving west. We didn't stop pressuring the tribes. It continued to happen. So just kind of think about that. I didn't really think about that whenever I first read this book, because you kind of thought the Civil War, all the entire military might was dealing with the South, but it's not completely true. We did continue to have regular ongoing war with the native tribes. So this sort of approach is very similar to what we're seeing in Israel. And this, I have an example here of a white settler. He's Israeli, but originally American, who comes and steals a Palestinian home, and they confront him about that.
This is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do this. I didn't do this.
But
It's easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
You are stealing my house.
Like I said, he's from America. You can tell by the accent, and he's trying to be at this edge of civilization in Palestine. And this is an explicit effort. And in the message, Coates talks about this pretty explicitly. Has been a plan from Zionist perspective from the 1890s to create an Israel and have it be Israeli, Jewish controlled and Israeli dominant. But just to be clear, Zionism and Judaism are different. Zionism is a far right group of beliefs around the domination of Israel by the Jews. Not all Jews support Zionism, and I think it's very important to call out. And many Jews, like Rabbi Danya Rutenberg, actually fight back against Zionism and believe that reparations and restoration is more important. So this approach was adopted essentially from the United States, and in some of the letters there's communication about using the same tactics. And so what happens is, in cases with like this New Yorker who becomes a settler, he has the explicit support of the IDF. And when there's conflicts, and if there is retaliation from the Palestinians who've lost their home, the IDF will come in and defend the settlers. And these settlements are considered illegal by the UN. They were considered illegal by the Obama administration and by the Biden administration. Not so with the Trump administration, of course. So it's really, really important that we're aware of the similarities of the techniques being used in Israel to push out the Palestinians, and what the white Americans did to push out the indigenous nations in the U.S. Coates directly addresses this in a couple different ways. He addresses it through the writings that he's found of Zionists. He interviews Palestinians directly and goes on to land that has been taken from them. There was one example of an artist commune that was attacked multiple times by Israeli settlers, and eventually the IDF came in to support them. And Coates also goes and interviews and talks with IDF members who now are regretful of the actions that they've caused in pushing out the Palestinians off their land. And I think it's important that Coates did have both these perspectives, because you're seeing the victims, you're seeing the victimizers, and you understand that there's trauma on both sides, and that there are people who want this to stop. But because there is enforced inscription or conscription, you don't really have a choice. You have to be a part of the IDF if you're Israeli. And for me, this question of Israeli forcefully pushing off Palestinians from their land was something that kind of hit close to home because of what I learned in this book. The City of David is a archaeology site that's just on the outskirts of Jerusalem, kind of part of outskirts of the old city of Jerusalem and part of the main city, the new city of it. And it was a portion of the Palestinian quarter. And to excavate the City of David, all the people that lived in that area, it's a large area, it's a large city, were forcefully evicted. I had no idea whenever I went to visit the City of David. It's a beautiful place. I really found it fascinating. I had no idea that it was part of a propaganda effort to kind of tie the Israeli nation and people to the land for thousands of years. And I also was completely unaware. I didn't see it whenever I visited it. There was a plaque put up in '98 from the U.S. ambassador about how important this site was for basically tying the history of who owned this land back to this Bronze Age city. Now, a lot of archaeologists don't actually believe that this was truly the City of David. So I think there's plenty to be discussed around that. But all these things together, I think, are really important for white Americans to reflect on, because these actions are actions from the 1800s, 1700s, and 1800s. They're being emulated now in a genocide that Israel is performing in Gaza. And given that Trump has greenlit 2,000-pound bombs back to the Israeli government again, there's a strong likelihood that we will see them move into the West Bank after the ceasefire is over. So it's important for us as Americans to understand where our tax dollars are going, that we are selling these weapons and providing these weapons to Israel. We are part of this. And considering how much pushback Coates had as he did his press junket for this book, specifically the a Good Morning America interview, where one of the hosts, a Jewish host, was very combative and very aggressive with Coates' comments about Palestine, and made him and asked him directly, do you believe that Israel has a right to defend itself? And considering most press junkets are usually pretty positive, even Jon Stewart was pretty positive whenever he interviewed Donald Rumsfeld a couple decades ago on the Daily Show. So it was pretty surprising. It really is an egregious step for Coates to have published this book, since he highlights the fact that he felt betrayed by the U.S. media and the Western media about the views of what we're seeing in Israel, that you can see that there's real serious pushback in what's allowed in this conversation. And I think it's important that if you're interested in learning more about this, you find some podcasts like Citations Needed. They have really good podcast about what's going on in Israel right now. A number of episodes. They have news briefs. And of course, TikTok has a lot of things going on. And if you even just read the news headlines and just see that the language where Palestinians killed X number of Israelis and compare that to Palestinians were killed, the language is much more passive. And if you assign the same agency to Israel, to the destruction of Gaza that is done from the Palestinians to Israelis, you really can see how powerful how much of the toll is for the Palestinians. So I think if you're interested in reading the message, it would be helpful to read the Between the World and Me beforehand, just so you have some context about who Coates is going into this discussion. He's an amazing writer, and I don't think that reading an Indigenous Peoples History is required reading to really understand this, but I think it gives some good context of the similarities between what we did in the United States and what's happening in Israel, and why people are saying it's settler colonialism, and that in a lot of ways it's our legacy that's being reenacted in Israel right now. Kind of like the same way it's our legacy that we saw with the doorway of no return, which is the doorway to the United States. They're all tied together, and I think it's important for white Americans to reflect on this. It's not always comfortable, but it's important to do the work to understand where the United States history is, because history of Israel didn't start on October 7th, 2023, and started in 48 and earlier when Britain dominated the mandate of Palestine. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give me some feedback. I'm welcome to critical feedback, but keep it polite. And if I'd love you to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you very much.